a distorted photo of a girl.
My parents were taught to be afraid that if I mingled with deaf children who didn't speak quite as well as I did, that I might lose my capacity to speak.
In another distorted photo, the girl crouches by a dog. She has a dark-haired bob. Vertical strips slide into place and close.
There are a few bioethicists who've looked at me, and I think it just doesn't compute that I could be a bioethicist and have a disability.
Gaps divide a photo of a dark-haired woman.
There's still an underlying feeling that actually we'd be better off without disabilities and without people with disabilities.
Dark concentric rings divide a grey-haired woman's face. The circles slide into place and close, smoothing her profile. She wears a hearing aid and earrings. Title: Perspective Shift. A line expands under the name Jackie Leach Scully. Jackie has cropped grey hair. She walks in a garden and works in an office. A booklet is entitled Inclusive Research.
The process of research is never something that leads to a black or white answer. It's like an explosion of colour and light. It's kind of an ever-branching line of questioning and answering, constantly becoming more and more complex.
She sits reading in a university courtyard.
At UNSW, I'm Professor of Bioethics, and at the same time, I'm Director of the Disability Innovation Institute at UNSW.
Text: Professor Jackie Leach Scully.
A bioethicist is someone who's interested in the ethical, and that often sometimes means social, political, economic questions that are raised by new developments in medicine, life sciences in general. Bioethicists try to think through some of those questions. Quite often they're called upon to give some kind of input into policy or practitioner guidelines.
I very much enjoyed watching Jackie become a world leader in her field, especially, I think, because she's not at all big-headed about it.
Professor Wendy Rogers.
Jackie's very well known internationally. She is one of the leading disability bioethicists in the world, and she's probably the leading feminist disability bioethicist in the world.
Debbie Plummer.
She can talk to the professional bioethics community, but also come over in incredibly down-to-earth language that anybody could understand. So I think she's an outstanding communicator.
Framed photos show Jackie as a child.
Both my parents were the kind of people who would have benefited a lot from more education than they had. But they were both very bright, very probing, and they encouraged me to be like that as well. I can't remember a time when I wasn't reading. I could read before I went to school. I can remember when I was quite small thinking that it might be possible to actually know everything. My mother was also disabled. She was born with only one arm. I never saw her expose it. She was always very careful to keep it hidden because that was the culture at the time. I think her life was seriously damaged by that. My father's family was Anglo-Indian. I was conscious of coming from a mixed-race background. I enjoyed the enrichment that having more than one culture gave to me. But I think my father and his family had it quite hard.
A baby wears an army beret.
I was 8 years old when I became ill with what was diagnosed eventually as meningitis, meningococcal meningitis. That resulted in me losing my hearing. I'd lost all my hearing in my right ear. I no longer bothered with that ear at all, really. It's purely decorative. And in the left ear, I've got about 5% of my original hearing left. My parents were a bit at a loss. The advice that they were given was that probably it would be best not to expose me to music.
A piano sits idle.
The music lessons stopped and the piano got left behind when we moved house. So that was the end of my exposure to music, really. I wish they hadn't made that decision, but they followed the advice that they were given.
A woman plays piano.
It's really important that kids who have a hearing loss or kids who are deaf are exposed to music in some form, because there's always something that you can get from music.
A man plays a violin.
I did go to a few ballet lessons when I was little. In retrospect, it had a lot to do with being interested in different ways of communicating feeling and ideas. It's remained a major interest in my life.
Sitting near a rehearsing orchestra, Jackie watches the conductor.
Certainly when I was a child, there was an intense drive to encouraging deaf children to learn how to speak in the first place and not to communicate using sign language of any kind or finger spelling.
Jackie's in an art gallery.
But I think it was a missed opportunity. It would have been an enrichment to be part of the hearing world and part of the deaf world, and to be able to have learnt and acquired sign language as naturally as I could have done.
A black leafy band crosses the otherwise stark canvas diagonally from left to right, top to bottom. Jackie sits by a waterfall.
I have been really lucky in the teachers I've encountered. There were teachers who made accommodations for me at a time when it wasn't standard. There was Helen Fowler when I was at primary school. When I was at secondary school, there was a teacher called Debbie Plummer.
Debbie, lifelong friend and former teacher.
She was the sort of pivotal person in the class. They were not in competition with her. They were hugely supportive of her.
She was a woman in science and she encouraged questions. And she was also somebody who had not only been to university, she'd been to Oxford. She made it seem possible for me to think that I could do that as well.
I knew that Jackie was of the calibre to get straight into Oxford, and I wanted her to have that chance.
Jackie gazes at the waterfall.
Going to university was an option for me, but I'd never imagined going to somewhere like Oxford or Cambridge. I was interviewed by the biochemistry tutor at Hertford College. There's a history of having sometimes disastrously low expectations of what people with disabilities can do. I went to the interview there more or less with the idea that this was going to be really good practice for other university entrance interviews that I might do, the ones that I might actually get into. He asked me why I wanted to study biochemistry. I said, because I like biology and chemistry. You could tell from the expression on his face that this was quite clearly the wrong answer. And he moved next immediately to what did I like to do outside of school. So I said I liked modern dance. And we had a 20-minute conversation about forms of communication that were non-verbal, about the connection between sign language and dance and gesture and so on. And it was a really interesting and nice conversation. It was in a physics lesson, and my headmistress came in and started talking to my physics teacher at the front of the class, and then they both turned and looked at me.
She views artworks.
They'd received a letter, and the letter was my acceptance at Oxford to read biochemistry. At the end of 4 years, I'd finished my undergraduate degree, graduated, and the next step would be to do a PhD.
Jackie's bound a PhD.
I had been living in a graduate house, a shared house, on the grounds of the college, and Monica was the person who was moving into the room that I was leaving. So she came to have a look at her new room. On that first occasion, I wouldn't even let her into the room because I was looking after a friend's hamster. So I kept the door shut, and we kind of had this weird conversation through a crack in the door about, that big. And she moved into that room, and I moved into the room literally next door. So she was the girl next door.
Do you know, I never did see the hamster.
Monica Buckland, Jackie's partner, sits beside her. A graduation photo of the pair.
We were sharing a big house, so we'd interact in the kitchen and meet and chat and so on. And I thought she was really interesting, and so I asked her out to the cinema, and she stood me up twice. You stood me up twice, woman.
The women both wear wedding bands. Jackie bushwalks.
I think I've often felt in my life not marginalised or marginal. I'd call it liminal, which is sort of on the edge of two things. Being mixed race, going to a fairly elite university, but not from an elite background, not really fitting into these places.
A building is marked Society of Friends.
If I'm pinned down, I think there probably is a meaning to life, and even if not, people need one. Ultimately, I found my way to the Quakers, the Religious Society of Friends, as they're called. Every church has its own jargon. The Quakers talk about holding in the light. with capital L. So the light is something to do with, the light of God, the light of the Spirit, however you want to think of it. And in the context of a meeting for worship, you're holding your thoughts in that light and hope to be guided so that you can discern what it is you're supposed to do, or your opinion, or make a decision.
Jackie sits alone among empty chairs.
During my undergraduate degree in biochemistry, I did wonder at the end of my first year whether I'd made a big mistake. A lot of it I had not found particularly exciting. Then we started doing molecular biology, and particularly genetics and molecular genetics that had excited me then, and when I was looking at what to pursue as a PhD. There were a few options that came up, and one of them was a PhD at Cambridge working on the development of mammary cancer, tumours of the breast.
A microscopic view of cancer cells.
The idea was to try to be able to identify the abnormal genes that were involved in particular steps along the pathway to a breast tumour. Nobody was going to do that kind of experiment on a human being. We were working on mice. It involved, first of all, developing what we called a viral vector, a kind of Trojan horse. What it does is infect, in this case, mouse cells.
In the gallery, artworks resemble microscopic biological images.
Scientists who work on something like cancer have a kind of quite divided attitude towards it, I think. It's an important thing to be working on. You also know that the whole process is so complex. It's highly, highly unlikely you're going to be the person to find, the cure for cancer. What your work is going to be is like, it's a little cobblestone on a very, very long road towards that goal. There would be a particular pattern that I would see if I'd got the right vector. And I remember there was a particular evening when I'd been running the experiments during the day, and on this occasion the pattern was exactly right. Kind of sat back in my chair and looked at it and said, "Hello, gorgeous," because I was so pleased. So I got the PhD effectively on the basis of having constructed a functional viral vector and going through the rest of the experiments, even if it turned out to be a negative result, which is still a result.
Monica plays the piano.
When we got talking about music, she always asked very interesting and intelligent questions. She didn't come with all the preconceptions that all my musical friends had. It made me look at music and how music works in a different way.
I knew from the outset that she was a musician. When we realised that things were pretty serious, I think I also realised that there was no future in this relationship unless I at least experienced something of music which was so important to her. I had listened to and enjoyed some of the pop and rock groups of the time, so I could hear them and I could enjoy them. I just felt that any other form of music that was maybe more complex would be beyond me. I had a real barrier about my own inability.
The conductor is Monica.
Since I've met Monica, I've been exposed to music again and given more self-confidence in the fact that I can enjoy it.
The orchestra rehearses.
The first concert I saw you in, it was Zadok the Priest, and I remember just being incredibly relieved as well as enjoying it, but relieved that she was clearly very good, and that I wouldn't have to try to think of something tactful afterwards to say to her.
Gay Liberation Front protesters.
Monica and I got together in the middle of all the fear-mongering in the 1980s when the AIDS epidemic reversed a lot of progress for gay and lesbian rights. We had to be very careful who was aware of our relationship and who was not.
It was a weird time, actually, always sort of checking your pronouns. If you're talking about my partner and I, never actually saying she. But I remember having piano lessons even after we exchanged rings and taking my ring off for piano lessons.
I also remember the look that we got from the jeweller when we went and bought the rings and we were buying
a
the same
filthy
ring.
look.
Yeah,
Absolutely.
A plane lands by snow.
I had already been offered a job as a postdoc in a place called Lausanne in Switzerland. And the reason I thought of going to Switzerland was because Monica fact, is half Swiss, and she wanted to continue her conducting studies. When we moved to Switzerland, we knew that we were going to be in different cities, and we still wanted to make a visible commitment to each other. So we had a private commitment ceremony, officiated, if you can call it that, by Debbie. Debbie had left teaching and become a minister, an ordained minister.
It wasn't possible for it to be in the church building because the Church of England didn't marry gay people or lesbian people. But I could see absolutely no reason why it couldn't happen on church property in the vicarage.
We actually sat in a circle in Debbie's house, and so
Like
it was
Quakers.
Yeah, which is what Quakers do. So it was pretty much a Quaker meeting in that there was a lot of silence, and then people read things, and Debbie kind of began and ended it.
Stained glass windows.
Many years later, in 2008, it had become possible in Switzerland to have a civil partnership registered officially. So on the 4th of April 2008, we were able to go to the City Hall in Basel, in Switzerland, where we were living, and have this done officially.
In a photo, the smiling Jackie and Monica hold wine glasses.
I really struggled on a more social level, living in Lausanne. The main reason for that is that I at least found French very, very hard to lip read. Accessibility is it's quite patchwork and quite varied. In one country, television captioning will be non-existent, for example, whereas something else will be really well provided for, and other countries vice versa.
Jackie and Monica bushwalk in winter clothes.
There was a fellowship that was being offered by the Quakers in Britain called the Joseph Rowntree Charitable Trust Fellowship. These fellowships were awarded to Quakers who would offer some kind of educational activity or training activity. So I offered to do workshops and lectures around the ethical issues to do with genetic engineering. But that introduced me for the first time really to public engagement activities, and also to people's questions about the ethical significance of the kind of science that I was doing. It was working with Quaker groups in England that drew me more into public engagement, and then eventually into bioethics. I then had the very good luck to meet Christoph Rehmann-Sutter, who's now one of Switzerland's best-known bioethicists. He was a philosopher moving into bioethics, and he didn't have a science background. I was a scientist moving into bioethics without a philosophy background. So it was a kind of match made in heaven, really. Christoph and I joined forces. We got a grant from the Swiss National Research Fund, and we set up the first interdisciplinary unit for bioethics in Switzerland.
Bioethics is a branch of applied philosophy, so we have to engage with the world and find out what's really happening so that we can inform the arguments and try and make better decisions. Part of what's happened in bioethics is what's called the empirical turn, where people are actually doing research. Bioethicists are doing research with members of the public, for example. So you find out a lot more valuable information about what people think. And Jackie was one of the pioneers doing this, meeting with groups of people in the context of a formal research project.
Asking us to discuss what connection that... I'm classed as an empirical bioethicist. There's still quite a strong tradition in bioethics of being very, very theoretical. I think theory is very important, but you need to have some idea of the everyday realities to work your theory on.
Jackie runs a discussion group.
It's unusual to have a bioethicist who's disabled. I have encountered some bioethics colleagues who just seem to find it quite difficult to cope with me because I'm a person with a disability and they're not used to seeing peers and colleagues as disabled. I felt that it's been more of an advantage than a disadvantage to be able to bring that experience into my bioethical thinking and also into bioethics, in general.
Jackie uses an ergonomic keyboard.
There's a long-standing tension between the world of bioethics and the disability world. Bioethics can be criticised for oversimplifying a lot of things, and one of them is disability. And I think it centres on what's seen by a lot of people with disability as bioethics defence of eugenic ideas. I suspect that there's still an underlying feeling that actually we'd be better off without them, without disabilities and without people with disabilities. I think that's unfortunate because bioethics needs to know more about disability in order to do its job better.
The members of her discussion group have disabilities. Jackie gazes at biological artworks.
Ultimately, I was invited by the Quakers in England, by the Religious Society of Friends, to give the Swarthmore Lecture in 2002.
The Swarthmore Lecture is the most prestigious piece of speaking and writing that the Quakers do annually, and she was asked to deliver it. And the words playing in the presence were the words that Jackie used for the title of her Swarthmore Lecture. Science for her has been playing in the presence of God all her life.
The lecture is in book form.
I'd been working with ideas about disability in bioethics for some time, and gradually realising that I felt that there was an approach to disability in bioethics that was lacking. And I wanted to introduce the idea of what I call disability bioethics, which was starting a bioethical exploration from a starting point of the perspective of people with disability.
Thankful and grateful for.
I don't think anybody else, at least at that time, was doing anything similar.
I'll say family is also important to me, and also friends.
In the early summer of 2015, I felt quite tired, quite run down, and I thought I had a summer cold or flu, something like that. It was the following weekend. I had to go away for a meeting and returned on the Saturday. And on Sunday, Monica said to me, "You've gone yellow." So we decided we'd better get this checked out. I was fairly convinced that we were making a big fuss about nothing in particular. The medical team's reaction on seeing my blood results suggested that something was actually quite wrong, and I was admitted to hospital. I'd had a viral infection which for some reason had really badly affected my liver. I think I'd been there for about a week when somebody first mentioned the idea that I might ultimately need a transplant, a liver transplant.
Well, the news that she needed a transplant was shocking. It wasn't surprising at that point, I have to say, because I knew pretty much she was dying because she was going into sort of multiple organ failure.
I remember sort of looking at my pee and seeing that it was dark green, it was the colour of spinach, and thinking quite objectively, that means my kidneys are packing up too, and I'm going into organ failure. And I knew I was dying.
Jackie walks in an old-growth forest. Debbie Plummer is interviewed.
It's very churning up when you're faced with a very close friend who may not survive. I just had to be real, and I just said, "I don't want you to die." And she said, "I don't want to die either." And I just handed everything over to the God who I believe is a healer. And then I blessed her.
I remember being wheeled down and looking at something like an air duct on the wall of the room before you go into the theatre. And then the next thing I knew, I was looking at the air duct again. The surgery had been successful.
In a photo, a smiling Jackie holds a blood bag.
It's always going to be a mixed thing because neither of us is ever going to forget that in order for her to survive, someone else's family lost a loved one.
In the forest, Jackie and Monica sit gazing at the towering trees. Jackie is interviewed in a sunny, stylish kitchen.
In 2017, I was elected to a fellowship of the Academy of Social Sciences in the UK.
The framed certificate is on display.
The fellowship was a recognition of her outstanding contributions to the field, and I think it's not an honour that many people get.
It's a mark of esteem to be elected to be a fellow. You can't just apply. For most of them, you have to be nominated by someone, so other people have to think you're good. And Jackie's a fellow of two Royal Academies, not only the Academy of Social Sciences, but also the Academy of Arts. So the arts one will be recognising her contributions via her philosophical bioethics work, and the social science one will be recognising her contributions through the empirical work.
Professor Wendy Rogers, Professor of Clinical Ethics at Macquarie University. Jackie poses with her certificate.
It's one of the two occasions in my life when I've received a letter that I was quite sure had been misdirected to somebody else called Jackie Leach Scully.
Wearing a slight smile, Jackie gazes steadily into the camera. She is thin with a pale, narrow face.
I had been at Newcastle University for 13 years. I was director of the Policy, Ethics and Life Sciences Research Centre. I didn't see myself moving. And then I was approached by UNSW to see whether I'd be interested in heading up the new institute that they were planning to open, Disability Innovation Institute at UNSW.
Jackie works in her UNSW office and strides through the grounds.
There have been one or two academics with disability who have been influential on me, but very, very few. We're quite rare. I think that's a real problem. I would like to think that younger academics, younger students, can look further up the ladder and see professionals with whom they can identify. They can see themselves in those positions.
Jackie moves among artworks in the gallery.
Definitely earlier on in my career, I wouldn't have mentioned that I was deaf. If I'd make an application, I certainly wouldn't mention it at all. If I got to as far as interview, it would be, I have a little problem with hearing. I mean, I certainly don't do that now. In part, that's to do with becoming just more established and more confident in your profession. It's also a change externally. It's the way that society has changed to become more accepting of diversity and of people with disability as well.
Jackie and Monica gaze over the Blue Mountains.
I think it's been really exciting to watch the journey that Jackie's taken from molecular biology through to bioethics.
In a photo, they pose with champagne. At home, they cook together.
We've been together for 33 years. Both of us are quite stubborn and decided we wanted this to work. So whatever difficulties we have had, we've worked through them. That's why we're still together.
In a commitment ceremony photo, they wear black and red.
One thing I often get asked is if you could take a pill now and have your hearing back, have your disability removed, you would have it, wouldn't you? I'm honest in saying that actually, no, I wouldn't.
An artwork of a network of cells hangs in Jackie's office.
I've been deaf long enough that I manage my deafness and my life perfectly well in order to have the life that I want.
She watches Monica rehearse.
I've gained a lot from the things that come along with disability. It is me. It's part of my identity.
Standing in the galley of biological artworks, Jackie gazes steadily into the camera. Cut to black. Audio description by The Substation. Credits: Attitude Foundation presents a Taste Creative production. Producer: Leah James. Executive Producer: Henry Smith. Series Director: Genevieve Clay-Smith. Writer: Genevieve Clay-Smith. Editor: Julian Newhouse. Created by Taste Creative for Attitude Foundation. Directed by Genevieve Clay-Smith. Executive Producer: Graham Innes. Director of Photography: Mikey Hammer. Filmed on location in New South Wales on the traditional lands of the Gadigal, Birrabirragal, Camaragal, Durrag and Gundungurra people. Funded by the National Disability Insurance Agency. Logos for Inclusively Made, Taste Creative and Attitude Foundation.